Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. And also, as always, if I don't answer your question in this video, then go ahead and copy and paste that question onto the bottom of this Patreon post, and I might answer it in the next one. Also, don't forget to post any new questions that you have, and also don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. And yeah, especially this month, I noticed there weren't as many questions, and so yeah, definitely leave any questions that you have, and it's pretty likely that I'll answer it in next month's Q&A. So let's jump right in. Karma asks, Matt, what are your thoughts on passive listening when you don't understand most of what is being said? I've watched a couple videos recently about comprehensible input saying that we should only really be trying to get 90 to 100% comprehensible input, and that passive listening when you don't understand much is absolutely pointless and shouldn't be done. I just recently started learning Mandarin and understand maybe 50 words max. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, so I completely disagree with the idea that you shouldn't listen to things unless you understand them 80 to 90%. I mean, anyone who's familiar with my background at all will probably know that I feel this way because I started off learning Japanese and immersing myself in content that I hardly understood anything of, maybe at the very beginning 10%. And that's the main content I used to grow my Japanese ability, and I was able to reach fluency within what most people would consider to be a really short period of time. So I just know from my direct experience that you can definitely learn from things that are not very comprehensible to you, and that this idea that, you know, it's a total waste of time, you need to understand almost all of it, I just know that it's not true. But in particular with passive listening, I think it's even more true because, first of all, as someone actually commented on this person's question and pointed out, the times during the day when you would do passive listening are times when doing active listening isn't an option. So, you know, when you're cooking, cleaning, taking a walk, these are times where you would be passively immersing. And during these times, it's not an option to do active work, like actively study grammar or actively immerse in something. And so the real option here is passive listening or nothing. If we're talking about active time, then, you know, it's more of a debate of how should you be using your time. Is it a good use of time to do this when you could be doing this other thing instead? But with passive listening, it's really passive listening or nothing. So if there's any benefit whatsoever, even the tiniest amount in passive listening at the beginning when you don't understand it very much, then you should do it, because the alternative is zero, to not get that benefit. And so, yeah, I just think it's actually quite like confusing to me why someone would strongly argue that there is literally zero benefit from listening to the language that you're trying to learn. Like, how could that be true? When we think about how we learn our native language, right? Pretty much the only thing that infants do from the moment they're born is get incomprehensible input, and they just listen to that 24/7 and end up, you know, learning the language in an incredibly short period of time. So in general, if something works really well for an infant, it's you know, not one for one. Obviously, adults and infants are different, but in general, you know, infants are on the right track when it comes to language acquisition. So I think if they're doing something, then probably it's a good idea to do that as well. But to kind of break it down and just get a little more analytical, first of all, so you said that you know 50 words in the language, right? So yeah, if you've been learning the language for any language for at least a week, you probably know at least 50 words. And in general, when you're starting a new language and you're learning words in the language, you learn the words in order of how common they are. So you learn the most common, most frequently used words first thing that you do. So if you know 50 words, that probably means that you know the most common 50 words in the language. And just due to the way that human languages are structured, the most common 50 words are used all the time, like every single minute. It's impossible to probably go 30 seconds of conversation without one of the most common 50 words being used at least once. Probably many of those words are going to be showing up multiple times. You know, in English, words like the, it, he, she, these types of super common words. And so the question is, if you know the most 50 common words in the language, that means that probably if you actually could pick out each of those 50 words every time that they were used, then you would be understanding multiple words in almost every single sentence. So just to repeat that, because I think it's actually a pretty profound idea. If you know 50 words in a language and every single time one of those 50 words comes up, you actually can recognize it and identify it, that means that you're going to be understanding multiple words in every single sentence. At least the vast majority of sentences. And so, but of course, if you're a beginner in the language, this isn't going to be your experience, right? You're probably going to understand literally nothing at the very beginning. Maybe every couple minutes you can pick out a word, or every couple sentences you can pick out a word or two. So what this means is, from the moment that you've learned 50 words in the language, there's already a gap between what you know and what you can actually understand what you can actually identify and understand in real native speech, right? It means there's words that you know, but when you hear them, you don't recognize them. It just goes over your head. You don't realize that you just heard a word that you know. And so when you think about what is the way to solve this problem of you know words but you're not picking them out, well, the only way is to practice listening, right? To practice actually identifying them. And so there's already something for your brain to do and practice with in incomprehensible input when you're listening from the very beginning, assuming that you know at least 50 words, right? You can practice trying to hear these words and get to the point where you actually are understanding multiple words in almost every single sentence, because the most common 50 words are shown up that often. And in reality, you're not going to stop at 50 words, right? You're going to keep learning probably between 5 to 10 words a day if you're actively learning a language. And so your vocabulary, the words that you know, is growing all the time. Yet again, can you pick out all of these words when you actually listen to native speech? Probably not. So that means that that's what you're going to be doing when you're doing that passive listening, right? It doesn't matter that you're not understanding most of it and that you can't follow the overall train of thought. You got to switch your mindset and realize at the very beginning you're playing a different game. You're playing the game of, I already know a bunch of words in this language, but I can't pick these words out yet. So I'm going to try to get to the point where I can pick out all of these words. Because if you can't even pick out the words that you do know, well then of course you're not going to be able to understand the overall line of thinking in the thing that you're listening to, or like the overall story or something, right? You got to be able to pick out words before you can like piece words together to understand full sentences. And in general, and another kind of final point I'll add is that when you first start learning a new language, there's going to be sounds in that language that your brain isn't accustomed to hearing, and there's going to be combinations of sounds and intonation patterns and stress and pitch and all these different phonetic phenomena that exist in the target language but not in your native language, or they're different from the way they're done in your native language. And so just by listening to the language, your brain starts kind of doing a statistical analysis on all the sounds that it's hearing, and it gets better at hearing all the different sounds, noticing all the different phonetic phenomena that happens in that language, and then you start noticing patterns. So even if you didn't know any words in the language and you just started listening, at the beginning, you wouldn't be able to tell where one word stops and another word starts, and it would just sound like mush. But over time, you'd start just naturally being able to hear the different word boundaries, and then you start picking out the most common words and the most common patterns. And so there's already, just from listening to language that's incomprehensible, there's a ton that your brain is gonna be doing and learning and benefiting from. Now, of course, if all you do is passive listening to incomprehensible input and you don't do any active study or any active immersion, you're not going to get very far, right? You're probably going to plateau at a point relatively early on, and then it's not going to benefit you anymore. But as long as you're supplementing that passive listening with active learning, then it's immensely beneficial. And again, your alternative is nothing at the beginning, right? Because you're doing passive listening during times in the day when doing an active activity wouldn't be an option. So of course, anyone who has followed me knows that I'm a huge proponent of passive listening, even in the beginning, even when you don't understand anything. I know from direct experience that it's really beneficial, and everyone else I'm sure some people have had different experiences, they disagree, whatever, but most of the people I've talked to who've actually tried it are also have found that it's beneficial, and they support it as well. So that's and now you understand my thoughts on why I think that way. So Joshua asks, what are your thoughts on the output hypothesis? So I'm assuming that this person means the comprehensible output hypothesis, which is a linguistic theory about second language acquisition that was created by Merrill Swain. I'm not extremely familiar with it, but I have seen it pop up every now and again, and I've read the Wikipedia page a couple times. And so basically, kind of seems like kind of similar to the output hypothesis. The input hypothesis, the comprehensible output hypothesis isn't like a very clean thing that you can state in one sentence. It's more like a collection of ideas, and these collection of ideas have to do with the idea that outputting in a foreign language leads to acquiring the language more effectively or more efficiently, because it basically enhances the effects of input in certain ways. And actually not just that, I think it's actually that there's some ways which we actually learn through output. There's other ways where output enhances input. And so in general, there's many cases where outputting will lead to overall quicker or more efficient acquisition than if you were only doing input. The one actual like succinctly stated version of the output hypothesis that I found in a paper that Stephen Krashen wrote is the comprehensible output hypothesis states that we acquire language when we attempt to transmit a message but fail and have to try again. Eventually, we arrive at the correct form of our utterance. Our conversational partner finally understands, and we acquire the new form we have produced. So that maybe that was like the original idea, but when you read the Wikipedia page, it kind of talks about multiple functions of output that aid input and the different ways that they help language acquisition. And it seems like all these different ways are under the umbrella of the comprehensible output hypothesis. So in particular, Wikipedia lists 3 functions of output that aid language acquisition that all fund, like I just said, are categorized under the umbrella of the comprehensible output hypothesis. And so the first one they call the noticing function, which Wikipedia says learners encounter gaps between what they want to say and what they're able to say, and so they notice what they do not know or only partially know in this language. So by outputting, you become aware of gaps in your knowledge. That's the first thing, the noticing function. And then there's the hypothesis testing function, which says when a learner says something, there is always at least a tacit hypothesis underlying his or her utterance, e.g. about grammar. By uttering something, the learner tests this hypothesis and receives feedback from an interlocutor. This feedback enables reprocessing of the hypothesis if necessary. So basically, whenever you say something in a foreign language, there's some kind of underlying hypothesis about how the language works. So for example, if you make some statement, you have a hypothesis that the statement that you make means X or will communicate Y in the language. And then you can receive feedback on this hypothesis based on whether the person who you're talking to seems to have understood you or not. So if they seem to understood you, then you know, okay, my hypothesis was correct. This statement means what I think it means. And if they clearly didn't understand you, then you know, okay, I guess what I said was wrong because it didn't communicate what I thought it would communicate. That's the hypothesis testing function. And then there's the metalinguistic function, which says learners reflect on the language they learn, and thereby the output enables them to control and internalize linguistic knowledge. So I'm not 100% sure on exactly what this is pointing to, but what seems to be what it's pointing at is that by outputting, you actually get to see if the conscious knowledge you had about the language was correct or not, and kind of organize your knowledge. It's kind of like when they say the best way to, if you've learned something, the best way to kind of internalize it is to actually try to use it in some way, use it yourself, and that will let you get a clearer sense of how well you actually understand it. I think that's what it's talking about, because it's saying, internalizing linguistic knowledge, and it's called a metalinguistic function, which I think refers to consciously thinking about how the language works. But like I said, I'm not 100% sure. So basically, my take on these ideas is that out of these 3 kind of functions of output, the noticing function, hypothesis testing function, and metalinguistic function, I think really only the noticing function is what I think actually is true and does have a positive input on a positive effect on overall language acquisition, and I don't really believe in the other 2. So what I mean by that is I've always kind of talked about this noticing function, how a lot of times when you go to say something, you might realize that you're not sure how to say it or you can't remember how to say it. And then when you go back to getting input and when you go back to immersing and that idea that you wanted to express comes up in your immersion, then you kind of have this aha moment of like, oh, I see, that's the way that you say it. And then next time you want to say it yourself, it'll come when you need it. You'll be able to remember it more easily. So that's definitely something I've experienced, and I definitely think there is kind of there's kind of a feedback loop when it comes to input and output in this particular way. But ultimately, you're still only learning from input. It's not like you realize that you don't know how to say something and then you make something up and then you get confirmation from a native speaker, I don't think that works. I think that ultimately, yeah, you can recognize you don't know how to say something, and then that will allow you to be more receptive to your input, to your immersion, and allow you to acquire it that way or remember it that way. And a lot of times when this happens, you actually have already acquired the thing. It's just not available to you. So, you want to say something, you kind of have this sense of like, oh, I know there's a way to say this in my target language. I've heard people say this a bunch of times, but I can't remember it. What was it? And then it comes up in your immersion and you're like, oh yeah, of course, that's it. And it's something that you've already been able to understand or that you've already known for quite a while, but you still have to go through this process once for it to really fully be there when you want to say it yourself. So it's not necessarily that this noticing function is allowing you to pick up on something that before you were oblivious to. I don't really think that happens very much. I've never really experienced that, but it does help you activate the knowledge that you have. So I definitely think, yeah, this noticing function plays a big role in getting good at speaking the language. But the hypothesis testing function, I think, doesn't really make any sense, because ultimately, if we're talking about learning how to speak a language in a native-like, natural way, then there's a very small margin of error, right? For most ideas that we want to express, there's a very limited number of ways that a native speaker would express that idea. And if there are multiple ways that a native speaker might express that idea, each one of them has a subtly different nuance, and only one of those kind of perfectly matches the idea that you want to express. So trying to kind of make up the language yourself and then see if you were on the right track or not based on the reaction of a native speaker, that model is just not accurate enough. It doesn't have high enough fidelity to help you reach the point of being able to speak in a native-like way, because the native-like way has such a small margin for error. And the reason for this is that you could say something that's like partially correct, or maybe it gets the main idea across, but it's still unnatural or grammatically incorrect, and native speakers will still understand you, right? Like if I wanted to say like, I go store, you come? Even though that's grammatically incorrect, most native speakers would know that what I'm saying is, I'm going to go to the store now. Do you want to come with me? And so even if I said this kind of broken phrase in English, the reaction of the native speaker would probably be some completely fine, right? It'd be like, oh yeah, sure, I'll come. Or like, oh no, sorry, I'm busy now. So from your point of view, right, your utterance succeeded in communicating the idea you wanted to communicate. And so your brain will kind of go like, okay, cool, this worked, checked it off. Hypothesis validated. When in reality, the hypothesis was at least partially wrong, right? Because it included mistakes that a native would never say. So because there's this gap between what you can say to be understood and what you need to say to sound natural and native-like, because this gap is so big, trying to basically reinvent the language by like creating your own hypotheses and then getting them either validated or invalidated by the reaction of a native speaker is just not going to work, because basically you're going to start getting like valid responses from a native speaker, or responses that validate your hypothesis, far before your accuracy reaches the point that you want it to reach, right? Now, of course, if you're trying to work with an italki teacher and you're having them literally point out every single mistake that you're making, I mean, I also don't think that's a good idea either, but in any case, that's not what this hypothesis is talking about. This hypothesis is talking about when you're just out in the world talking, trying to communicate in your target language, you naturally receive this feedback from native speakers. And so, yeah, I don't think the hypothesis testing function works, and that's why Refold is based on the idea largely that you need to have your own intuition. You need to be able to kind of give yourself feedback as to whether you're on the right track or not, because language is so exact and so subtle that basically feedback that you get from the outside is just too low quality, too low resolution for you to get your output to the point that you want it to be at. The only way to get it there is to build a very subtle, accurate intuition for the language through getting mass input. And then the last idea here, the metalinguistic function, I mean, it's harder for me to comment on because, like I said, it's not the description here is kind of too minimal for me to like fully understand what it's pointing to. But like I'm assuming that it has something to do with helping you kind of organize conscious knowledge that you have about the language. And again, the input hypothesis, which says, and in my experience, it's true, that what you can do with conscious knowledge in output is very limited, because conversation moves too quickly and we don't have enough mental bandwidth to be thinking about conscious rules and conscious knowledge when we're in the middle of talking. And so anything that has to do with conscious knowledge is not really very helpful. So in general, yeah, I think that most of the idea, when you actually read, like, what are the ideas behind the comprehensible output hypothesis, I think most of them I don't really agree with, except for that one piece about the noticing function where, yeah, outputting allows you to become aware of gaps in your knowledge, and then when you go back to your input, that you become more receptive to your input. I definitely think that aspect of it is true. The aspect of it where you basically repeatedly try to express an idea over and over again in different ways until you finally succeed in communicating, and then that allows your brain to figure out the language. So you're basically reinventing the language through your output. I think that is never going to work. Now, I think there's another big benefit of output, and probably the biggest benefit of output that actually the comprehensible output hypothesis doesn't really comment on at all, which is this kind of idea of group membership, which is something that Stephen Krashen talked a lot about in my interview with him. If you go and watch that interview, he kind of talked about how he thinks a big kind of missing factor when we're talking about language acquisition is group membership, where basically if you have a group of friends who speak your target language and you regularly spend time with them, and your identity kind of shifts to the point where you feel like you are a member of this group is actually your in-group, then you're naturally going to acquire a lot more. And another kind of way to talk about the same idea is through I think it's pronounced Girard, right? Girard's theory of or Girard's mimetic theory of desire, which is this interesting kind of sociological theory that one of the core functions of the human psyche is basically to copy the people around us. And I think originally it was talking about how we learn what to desire and what we want by copying the wants of other people around us, and then that leads to competition, and that creates kind of conflict within society. But I think when you look at this theory more broadly, it's kind of saying that one of the core functions of the human psyche is to copy the people in its environment. And the reason why we have this function is because, humans are born with being closer to a clean slate than a lot of other animals, right? Like most animals, they can walk after a few minutes of being born, whereas it takes an infant, months or years to learn how to walk. And so in this way, we're kind of born more in a blank slate, and basically we come with less stuff pre-programmed, and we need to install lots of software after being born. And so the way that we do this is by copying the people in our environment. And that's why humans can differ so much depending on the culture that they grew up in. And so I definitely think there's kind of this subconscious process that happens in the brains of every normal human that is kind of always analyzing the people in our environment and deciding who is our in-group and who is our out-group, and trying to basically become as close to the people that we identify as our in-group, right? As being like us. We kind of define what is desirable, how do we want to be ourselves, based on the people in our environment who we identify as being part of our own group. And so it's kind of like if you imagine in middle school, the kids, have some group of friends, and they all copy each other, right? In terms of what hobbies they have, what clothes they wear, what kind of slang they use, and things like that. And I think that this process kind of continues on throughout our entire lives, although I think it happens more when you're, a young child or adolescent. And I think that actually it has a lot of overlap with language learning, because if you exist in a social environment where, let's say you actually are living in the country, and you kind of have cut all your ties to people from your native country who speak your native language, and the only people who you have social interactions with, the only in-group that you have are native speakers of your target language, then in a way you're probably this unconscious part of the brain that is always analyzing our environment and running pattern recognition and trying to move yourself and your identity to match the environment so that you can blend in and survive well within your in-group, is going to benefit your language learning, and it's going to apply to language learning, right? You're that subconscious part of your brain that's most concerned with social survival and social thriving is going to be analyzing the ways that people speak and trying to get you to the point where you sound exactly like them. And so I do think that there's a benefit. This isn't strictly a benefit of output. It's actually a benefit of just being in an environment where your native language is spoken and you have an actual social group where the language is spoken. Generally, you have to output to a degree to be in this situation, right? How can you be in a social group that speaks your target language if you're not speaking your target language, right? So if you actually enter into an environment where your target the people who you view as your in-group are native speakers of your target language, I think you're probably going to improve really quickly. And this is what Stephen Krashen was talking about with group membership. And not only are you going to improve quickly, but you're not going to plateau. You're going to go on to sound very, very close to a native speaker, because your brain's not going to be satisfied with being able to communicate, right? It's only going to be satisfied once you totally blend in, because the part of your brain that is kind of functioning as the driving force here is the one that wants to fit in socially. And so, this is something I've been thinking more about. So I think that's probably one of the biggest benefits of, actually, I wouldn't say output but in particular, but just jumping into a world where your target language is spoken, is being able to benefit from this effect in the brain. And so I wouldn't actually recommend doing this in the first couple stages, but that's probably something that would be ideal for stage 4 in Refold, when you want to really close that gap from being fluent to being native level. I think something you'd probably, one of the best ways, and perhaps one of the only ways to like fully close that gap, would be to move to the country and put yourself in an environment where everything is done in that language. So Ganizmit asks, do you think that understanding Japanese audiobooks is significantly more difficult because of homonyms? I find that sometimes it takes a lot of effort to determine which word is being said. For example, when I hear kankyo, first thing that comes to mind is this kanji, when in fact this kanji was intended. He's writing the kanji in the question. Obviously, I can't really verbalize that. So I have to retroactively process the sentence for the second time, or carefully listen to the next few words in order to get what was really meant and not get confused. Sometimes words can be used out of context. Sometimes there is a made-up word. Sometimes context won't be enough to disambiguate the meaning. Another example would be dokushinjutsu versus dokushinjutsu, and he gives more examples of homonyms that have different kanji, but they pronounce the same. I'm quite advanced, yet sometimes I need to pretty much choose an interpretation instead of just processing what is being said, like in other languages I know, and that's really frustrating. I'm asking about audiobooks because, in general, rare vocabulary that can be confused with more common homonyms tends to be used in books, and it's not a problem for visual media. It seems like spoken Japanese inherently is a bad tool for deciphering difficult texts. I would imagine understanding dictionary definitions auditorily would be very difficult, especially when a lot of kanji is used in a row. Do you know how Japanese people deal with these problems? How do you feel about it? Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts in regards to this topic. The first one is, obviously, if you are in tune with pitch accent, that solves some of these issues, because sometimes there'll be two words where they have the same kana but different pitch accents. And so if you are tuned into pitch accent, then you instantly know which one is being said because of the pitch accent. And that's something that I benefit from now that I've kind of installed pitch accent into my brain. So that's one thing. Although I will say that it seems like the thing that this person is particularly struggling with are these kind of like rare kanji words that don't show up that much in everyday speech but show up a lot in texts. And in general, a lot of these words are all just pronounced heiban, and so the pitch accent's the same between a lot of these. And so pitch accent, it's not like the magic key that's going to solve this issue. It's something that will definitely help, but I still think the issue this person is raising does stand. So firstly, I'll say, yeah, I think understanding Japanese audiobooks is significantly harder than understanding Japanese texts. And in some cases, you could even say perhaps understanding Japanese audiobooks is more difficult than understanding English audiobooks, for example. And this just has to do with the nature of kanji, right? When you think about kanji within Japanese, this was not an organic phenomenon that evolved over time. And at a certain point in Japanese history, Japanese people went and borrowed the written alphabet, or it's not an alphabet, but a written character set of a language that was entirely different from itself, and shoehorned it into the language. And this created an insane amount of words that have the exact same pronunciation. So yeah, there's just way more words. Like, I'm sure if you look up just kankyo in the dictionary, there's probably like 20, maybe even 30 words that have that exact same pronunciation. And this just doesn't happen in English, and I'm assuming other languages, right? There are words that are pronounced the same in English, but nowhere near the extent and the volume that exists in Japanese. And this has to do with this kind of artificial borrowing of an alphabet, or a writing system that didn't really match the language, and the complicated history with kanji and things like that. So yeah, this is a tricky issue, and Japanese people are very conscious of the fact that if you use rare words, like rare Kongo are words that are just like generally two kanji, and it has the onyomi, the Chinese reading. So and that's really what we're talking about here, Kongo that have, you know, a ton of homonyms. So Japanese people are very aware that if you use rare Kongo in speech, it's going to be hard to understand, and a lot of people are going to be confused. And so, in general, when a Japanese person is writing something that is eventually going to be read out loud, they are going to write in a different style than if they're writing for something that's going to be read. Because if something is going to be read, then disambiguating between homonyms is not relevant at all, because the kanji makes it crystal clear. But yeah, if a text is going to be read out loud, then you have to think about, well, what words are people going to hear and instantly understand, and what words are people going to hear and it's going to take them a second to think about what the kanji would be. And so Japanese people have an intuitive sense for this. I think anyone who's been learning Japanese for a long time also develops an intuitive sense for it. And so in general, Japanese people will, if a text is going to be read out loud on the radio, on the news, or something like that, they will consciously use different words so that it's easy to understand when it's spoken. And actually, some audiobook companies, I mean companies that, you know, take novels or take books and turn them into audiobooks, they will actually keep this in mind, and they will change some of the wording that would be particularly hard to understand in spoken form into something that is easier to understand in spoken form. And there's been a couple times where I got an audiobook and then I got the original book as well. And I tried to like listen to the audiobook while reading the book, and they didn't match up. Like they matched up like 95%, but every once in a while there'd just be like a different phrase. Like one phrase would be switched out with another phrase that means the same thing. And the reason why they do this is to make the audiobook easier to understand when you're listening to it, and get rid of these words that are hard to disambiguate when you can't see the kanji. But other audiobook companies don't do this, and they will just read it out exactly as it's written. And that's what causes these problems, right? Basically, the problem that you're talking about stems from the fact that someone wrote a text and intended that text to be read and for the kanji to be seen, and then someone else just took that text and read it out loud. And so you're listening to a text that the author didn't write with the text being spoken in mind, right? So that's why there's basically a disconnect, right, between the author's intent and what you're hearing. The author wasn't worrying about whether it would be easy to understand when you listen to it in spoken form or not. And so that is kind of the root of this problem. Now, I will say that the better you get at Japanese, the less that you'll struggle with this. And over time, even for words that you would think would be really rare and you wouldn't have a lot of opportunities to come across, your brain will get really good at telling from the context instantly which one is being used, and you won't have to think about it. There won't be any kind of time delay in your mind. So that will happen more and more over time. But I still think, at the end of the day, the challenge is always going to be there to an extent. And I think that even Japanese people probably occasionally struggle with this. Like if you took a super hard text and you had someone make an audiobook out of it, and they didn't actually change out any of the wording or anything, a Japanese person, probably every couple minutes there would be a word where they're like, huh, what kanji is that? And they didn't get it. But if you're good enough at Japanese, even if you miss a word every now and again, you can still follow the overall conversation just from the context, basically. So overall, I'd say it doesn't really become a huge problem when you get good, when you just get really, really good, because like I said, most of the time you're able to tell which one it is from context. And even when you miss one here or there, it's like, it doesn't throw you off too much. But because of the way that kanji was adopted into Japanese, there are an insane amount of homonyms, and sometimes this does make spoken Japanese harder to understand. I think, this wouldn't have happened if Japanese evolved naturally, but because of shoehorning this other writing system into it consciously, that it created this problem. So, it is a real issue that you're experiencing, but overall, I would say if you just keep reading, keep listening, you'll get to the point where it doesn't really throw you off too much anymore. So Nutella asks, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to learn a language but is not tech savvy enough to use tools like Anki? I had someone I had someone ask me how I'm learning a foreign language, and even after explaining what I do in simple terms, their first reaction was, "Oh, I'd never be able to do that." What would you recommend to do for the beginner process of learning the first 1K words for somebody who is not great with computers? So my first reaction would be to try to convince the person that actually they are able to do it, because if you tell them like, oh, I use this program, it has an algorithm, blah blah blah, maybe somebody who has the idea in their head that they're bad with technology would have the first reaction of just like, oh, that sounds so complicated, I can't do that, no, go away. But I would try to be like, no, wait, it's really easy, you could do it. I know somebody who was even worse at technology than you and they did it, and just try to at least get them to give it a shot. Because when we're talking about Anki, especially if you're using like a pre-made deck, it's like not very hard. Like you sit down, you install the program, you open up the pre-made deck, and then you click learn, and then you just study. Like maybe you have to change the settings once, but there's a really clear guide on how to do that on the Refold website. So it's really not very hard. I mean, yeah, I think when you're talking about setting up all these add-ons and other programs that integrate with Anki to do hyper-optimized sentence mining, a lot of that, yeah, well, if you're not tech savvy, I wouldn't recommend that to you because it's going to be too much of a headache. But if we're just talking about learning a pre-made deck with vanilla Anki, I think even I could get my grandma to be able to do that, and she's the least tech savvy person that I know. But if the person really does not want to use Anki, they don't have a computer or something, then I mean, you have to come up with some kind of way to learn the words. What's the word? In some kind of analog fashion, right? So one option is you can use paper flashcards. People have been doing that since the beginning of time. Most people have had an experience of being in a grade school and trying to study for some tests with paper flashcards. It definitely works, right, in the short term. And I think it'd be good enough for the first 1K words because they're going to be coming up so often that you can, if you're doing immersion, that will be enough to kind of reinforce them. And so, yeah, you just need to somehow obtain a list of what the most common words are and what they mean. And then you can make paper flashcards, or some people, they have other, memorization techniques they like writing the word over and over in a notebook or something. Obviously, these are not as effective as Anki, but they can get the job done. And most people who, went to school have some technique they've developed that works for them when they need to memorize a list of stuff. So I think, yeah, it's not that hard to kind of figure out a way to memorize the meaning of 1,000 words, even without using any technology. So that's what I would do. But yeah, I mean, if you can't use Anki, then after the 1K words, then it kind of is going to be, how are you going to keep growing your vocabulary after that? But I mean, even then, I mean, it seems like still to this day, most language learners don't use Anki. They use I see a lot of people on Twitter and like YouTube videos on like how I study French or something, where they're just like, will immerse basically, and then they'll like write down the words that they came across in a notebook, and they probably never actually review the notebook afterwards, but the act of writing it down and looking it up, creates a memory that can be reinforced through immersion. So I mean, yeah, you can learn a language without Anki. Most people throughout history who have learned a foreign language didn't use Anki because Anki hasn't existed for very long. But yeah, that's what I'd say. Just if you don't want to use Anki, you just got to supplement it with some manual analog technique that works for you. Simple Milk asks, when it comes to mining sentences and making flashcards, I find that making cards during free flow immersion is much easier and more comfortable for me compared to intensive immersion. But are there any drawbacks or negative effects of mining sentences during free flow immersion versus intensive immersion? I mean, ultimately, whatever works for you. In this case, I would say if making cards during free flow immersion works for you, then just go with that. I don't see any real downside to it. What I would say is that the kind of idea with free flow versus intensive is that free flow is when you're just sitting back and kind of you're turning your conscious mind off, letting your unconscious mind take over, and you're just kind of chillaxing and enjoying your immersion without having to do any hard work. Whereas intensive immersion is when you're more actively looking things up, and in general making cards, right? So when you just think about, you have these two modes, a more engaged, active, effortful mode, and then a kind of relaxed, effortless mode. Making cards takes an active effort, so it just kind of makes sense that the active effort would be done during the mode that is geared towards active effort. So yeah, I mean, that's why we kind of like designed it that way. But I mean, yeah, making cards during free flow immersion just overall works better for you, then go with that. No real reason not to. So Seth asks, what do you think of adjusting video speeds when streaming Netflix or YouTube? If you set it to 0.75 speed, for example, that might help with comprehending fast speech, right? Or is this a bad idea because it's better to just take the content as native level speeds? So yeah, I think I've talked about this a couple times in the past, but I don't recommend slowing things down I don't recommend slowing things down ever. And I only recommend speeding things up if you're already fluent and you're like at stage 4 and you're doing that as a stage 4 activity. So I'll talk more about that in a second. But first, just with slowing things down, I mean, really slowing things down or speeding things up distorts the audio. So when you're slowing it down, you can hear that it sounds kind of distorted, right? It doesn't sound like language really sounds. And so I think it's not really going to be effective in the long term to be feeding your brain this kind of distorted input that's not a real representation of how people actually talk and how real audio or real speech sounds. And in general, it's like you at some point you got to get used to native level speech, right? Because people speak at native level speed in real life. And so in general, I just think, as infants, we all learned our native language by listening at native level speech. I think that's what the brain is kind of built to do, the language acquisition part of the brain. And also, yes, slowed down speech is distorted. And so you also don't want to be feeding your brain distorted input. So yeah, I would say just get used to normal speed from the beginning. And when it comes to speeding things up, I've had other people ask the question of, if I speed up my input, will that be a more efficient way to learn? Because I'll get more condensed input. My input will be more dense. So I'll actually like come across more words per hour. And I also wouldn't recommend doing that just because, again, when you speed it up, it gets distorted. And so that in itself is not good. But also it's making it harder to understand. And so it's less comprehensible. So in general, I think, like I said, the brain, we evolved acquiring language that is spoken at normal natural speeds. And so that's probably what's going to work the best. And changing that in any way is kind of deviating from the reality. And so especially speeding up, it's like just actively making it harder to understand. So I wouldn't recommend that unless you're basically already at stage 4 and you're just trying to basically grow you already understand most things, but you're trying to just take your listening ability to the next level. It's kind of like when you imagine people, they like, in Dragon Ball Z, they would, when they were training, they'd wear these boots that weighed like 100 pounds each, so that even when they're doing normal activities, they're like growing their muscles even more. And maybe people train like that in real life. I don't know. They probably do. But it's kind of like that. You're purposely making it even harder than it really is so that your brain is forced to take its listening ability to the next level. But this is something that you're doing once you already, like basically once understanding normal speech is no problem for you, right? Then you learn how to understand it even when it's like really fast and distorted, right? You wouldn't wear boots that weigh 20 pounds each to train when you can't even walk without boots yet, right? It's like first you learn how to walk without any heavy weights, and then if you want to take your training to the next level, then you can put on the weighted boots. So I'd say that's how I think about speeding up speaking your target language. It's something you do after you already have basic fluency and normal understanding isn't an issue for you. So Nick asks, any advice for people who are starting in L3 but still feel like they should focus on their L2? I think this problem persists until you're extremely advanced in your L2, but hearing your thoughts / advice would be helpful since you yourself used to have this issue. I mean, if you feel like you the way this is worded, advice for people who are starting in L3 but still feel like they should focus on their L2. Well, if you still feel like you should focus on your L2, why are you starting in L3? It's not really a good idea. That's my number. Like, ultimately, the way I think about it is, don't expect that you're going to be able to continue improving in your L2 as you learn in L3. It may be possible, but don't count on it. Consider yourself lucky if that works out for you. what I would assume is that the best you can do is maintain your L2 while learning an L3. That's if you want to not run into a lot of frustrations, just assume that improving an L2 and an L3 at the same time aren't going to be possible. I think that's kind of what I ended up doing, and that's what kind of solved my struggles with this issue. So what you have to decide is, do you want to keep improving your L2? If so, then don't start on L3 yet now, or don't work on your L3. Put that L3 on pause. Do you want to learn an L3? Well, then put your L2 in maintenance mode and expect that you're not going to be able to improve at your L2 until you basically switch things around and put your L3 in maintenance mode and then put your L2 back into improvement mode. So that's the way that I would think about it, especially when you're trying, just the fact that you're asking this question kind of, and the fact that, you watch my content, that you're into Refold, makes me tend to assume that you want to get really good at the languages that you learn. You're not kind of just looking to get to like a survival level or like a B2 level in a bunch of languages. And so if that's the case, then yeah, like if you're at a B2-ish level in a language and you want to take it to the next level, like you want to go from stage 3 to stage 4 in Refold, or really take basic fluency to a near native level, that takes a huge amount of commitment and focus. And so I wouldn't count on being able to do that while you're working on trying to learn a new language from scratch. If you're the type of person who, you have a bunch of languages that you're dabbling in, then yeah, you can do multiple languages at a time and still make some progress. But I think when people take that strategy, they're not really making strides towards reaching a high, strong level of fluency in the language. They're more making strides towards, being at a B2 level in a bunch of languages in the long term. So that's, you got to always, when you're watching these polyglot videos or people are talking about learning a bunch of languages at once or just learning a bunch of languages in general, remember that most of these polyglot type people don't end up getting very good in very many languages. And even when they do, they don't oftentimes maintain that ability in their languages, right? A lot of times, even polyglots who do get really good in languages, they will have like a couple languages that they're good at a time, and then a bunch of other languages that have gotten really rusty because they haven't been able to work on them. And they just accept this as the reality of, being a polyglot. So yeah, if you're thinking about long term, you want to, let's say, have like near native competency in 3 languages, then I would assume that the best way to do that is working at one language at a time. And so I think it is valid to say, your L2 isn't where you want it to be ultimately, but you're going to put it in maintenance mode and work on an L3 for a while, and then later you're going to go back to the L2 and take it to the next level. I think that's a valid strategy, but just keep in mind that if you think about languages as juggling, once you throw that third ball up and now you're juggling 3 balls, you can never really go back to having only 2 balls, right? Because once you get an L3 going, you learn a certain amount of it, then you have this sunk cost, right? You don't want to say, you don't want to go and forget all of that and have to relearn it later. You want to maintain it. And so now you're stuck in this position where you have 2 things in the air that you always have to balance. Whereas if you were a monolingual person and then you picked up an L2, then, you don't really have to worry about your native language. And so you only have one thing to worry about, your L2. And you can put all your time and energy into that. You don't have to balance anything. You can completely focus on it. And so if you're really what I would recommend ultimately is get to your final ultimate goal in your L2 before you pick up an L3. That's going to be what's going to be the most stress-free path in the long term. Because the best time, like let's say you're at like a C1 level in your L2, but you want to go to a C2 level, or you're like at a high level of fluency, but you want to totally bridge the gap to native level. The best time to do that is when you can focus entirely on that and you don't have to worry about balancing anything or about something else getting rusty when you're in the meantime. And it's kind of just common sense, right? So if you're ever thinking about improving your L2, then consider the fact of like, do I want to improve my L2 now when all I have to worry about is my L2, or do I want to improve my L2 later when I'm going to have an L3 ball in the air and I'm going to be having to juggle all this stuff, So just think about it carefully. You got to really weigh all the pros and cons. So Lukey Jano asks, Are there any things from an immersion-based language learning approach that could be adapted for use in learning other skills, for example, drawing or making music? Or is the act of learning a language just too fundamentally different from learning something else? So the way that I think about it is that for every skill that you might want to learn, there's going to be an optimal balance between input and output to make the most efficient progress. So in language learning, this input to output balance is very, very heavily biased towards the input side, right? And this balance to the input side is probably more extreme than any other skill, where you're literally doing nothing but input for months or years before you start outputting at all. That's very intense. So I don't think any other skill is going to match that ratio. But I think for a lot of skills, like let's say even piano or learning of sports like skateboarding or learning how to juggle or something like that, I think input always plays a role. And actually, Lamont had a video recently. Lamont from Days of French and Swedish had a video called Language Learning Isn't Like Anything Else. I think that was what it was called. And it had a thumbnail of something related to music, I think. But in the video, he compares language learning to music. Even though he's saying ultimately it's not like anything else, he still makes this comparison to try to help illustrate a point. And he makes the point how input would be really important even in learning music, or is important, right? Like if you're going to try to play a song by Beethoven without having ever heard it before, and you're like a beginner to music, then that's not going to be realistic, right? You'd have to have some person who has heard the song before standing next to you and telling you exactly where you're wrong and how to change it the entire time, and that's like not really realistic. So even in a skill like music, right, obviously it's going to be hard to play something if you don't know how it's supposed to sound, and so getting input is important. And I'd say that probably in general in all skills, the input plays a bigger role than most people realize. Now, if you ever talk to an expert in the field, they probably realize this, right? They realize the importance of input and things like that. But the average person who's kind of an amateur at something, my intuition tells me based on what I've seen that most people in general in all fields devalue input and overvalue output. And so maybe in music, people are doing a ton of practicing, but they're not doing enough input in watching professionals play, like listening to professionals play and watching how their fingers move, or just listening very, very carefully to how it sounds over and over and over to develop your ear and being able to hear different subtleties. And even in like sports, right? Like with skateboarding, I used to skateboard. I think if you spent a lot of time like watching videos of pro skateboarders, especially maybe in like, watching them in slow motion, looking exactly how their feet move, then you're going to be able to improve a lot faster than if you are just trying to basically like reinvent the wheel yourself and you don't actually know exactly how your foot's supposed to move. You're just kind of trying it through trial and error. Obviously, it does take a lot of practice in any of these skills, even more practice than in language learning in general, to get good at a musical instrument, get good at skateboarding or any of these skills. But I think input helps a lot. And so it's when you combine the two with the ideal ratio or balance, then you make the ultimate or the most optimal progress. So yeah, I think probably the hypothetical, like most optimal input to output balance is different for every single skill. But the idea that there is a balance like this is maybe something that you could take to language learning, or take from language learning to another skill. And so just asking yourself the question, in this skill, what is the ideal balance between input and output? Am I actually actualizing that balance? And just maybe asking yourself, what ways could I benefit from input in this skill? Like what way could I use input to help me improve more efficiently? I think asking yourself those questions is something that could be really helpful in learning any skill. And I think just in general, getting good at something, period, is a really beneficial experience, because first of all, it gives you confidence in your own just ability to teach yourself something and to go from sucking to not sucking, right? Having that experiential reference point is really important for your confidence and for your ability to commit to something. And also all the habits and skills that go into staying consistent with practicing or dedicating time to something over a long period of time, working towards a final result. That obviously will carry over completely from language learning to other skills. So that's the way that I kind of view that. So I guess I'll make this the last question. Mark asks, "Hey Matt, I'm wondering, are you guys working on a next Japanese deck, or are there any plans for one in the near future? Just wondering because I'm coming close to finishing the JP1 deck and I found it very beneficial and I'd love to see a follow-on." So yeah, we're working on the JP1K V2 right now. That will come with example sentences and audio for the example sentences, and it'll also just be improved in multiple other ways. In addition to that, we chose better words to actually teach and things like that, and the card template will be a lot nicer. And so we're working on that. That should be out within the next couple months. Probably won't take multiple months, but I'm just, things always seem to take longer than you're planning. So I'll just say a couple months for now. And eventually we might make other decks that, like for maybe a 2K deck or a second 1K deck that's meant for people after finishing the 1K. The deck we're making now is meant to replace the current JP1K. So if you've already finished the JP1K, there will be no reason for you to go through this new deck we're making, because it's basically covering the same ground, just doing a better job of it. But in the future, we might actually make something that's meant to come after that. So there's like a 1K deck, and then there's a second 1K deck that teaches you the next most common words. So then when you finish both, 2K. But that's not a super high priority right now, because once you have the 1K, that's enough to go on to sentence mining and go on with the rest of Refold. So the second K is a lot more optional, and there's kind of like diminishing returns with going through pre-made decks. So I don't know when we'll get around to that, because it's not a high priority, but we'll probably do that at eventually some point. And we're also working on 1K decks for other languages. We released the Spanish 1K deck, the ES 1K, and we have some other ones in the works right now. So those should be coming out pretty soon. So yeah, that's all the questions for this week. Thank you guys so much for asking. And yeah, again, don't forget to repost those questions on the bottom of this Patreon post. So yeah, thanks so much for supporting, and I'll see you guys next time.